When I first got a job as an assistant in Hollywood, someone told me that the best thing I could do as an assistant was to make other people look good. It ended up being pretty decent advice, but it was nowhere near the right wording. I certainly wouldn't have moved upwards as quickly as I have if I'd just sat there and worked on the way people thought about my boss. What he should have said was this: find canvases for other people to paint on. And these are the opening lines to a 2008 blog post written by Ryan Holiday titled The Canvas Strategy. But before we get into that, I'd like to welcome you to Icons, a podcast about how to make things like the greats. A podcast that's usually usually every episode is focused on a particular artist, where I take the biographies or autobiographies of artists like Leonardo da Vinci, Coco Chanel, Christopher Nolan, and I dissect them for stories and insights behind the creation of their masterworks. And I do this so that we might take ideas from them to make things ourselves. But in this episode, this very special episode, I'm trying something different. And instead of focusing on one particular artist, I'm looking at a blog post which later became a chapter for a book called Ego is the Enemy. Great book, by the way. And they're both written by a modern icon, someone named Ryan Holiday. And you might know Ryan Holiday through the work that he's most known for now, which is around the ancient philosophy of Stoicism. But he's been fascinated with creativity and how to cultivate a creative career throughout his entire career, especially when you go into some of his earlier blogs. But also his books in general are gold for anyone working on a creative outlet, particularly that of the book Perennial Seller, a book that I absolutely adore. It's focused entirely on how to make things that last. So in this episode, I'm breaking down the best ideas from that blog post, and then the later chapter, which is known as Follow the Canvas Strategy, and adding a few examples that I've collected that will pair nicely, I think, with this idea. So let's firstly set the context. Let's look at the common challenges amongst young, ambitious types. The challenges that usually exist for those types is that they have to do a lot of grunt work, and this grunt work is usually stuff that they don't want to do. And for creatives, worst of all, it's probably not that creatively fulfilling. In Ego is the Enemy, Holiday says, the unappreciated genius is forced to do stuff she doesn't like, for people she doesn't respect as she makes her way into the world. How dare they force me to grovel like this? The injustice, the waste. And if you've experienced this or you feel this way, then you're not alone. And in fact, this feeling transcends societies and generations. And this is where I want to tell the story of Martial, a writer during the Roman Empire. And he's someone who served under two patrons. These patrons included Mela, who was a wealthy businessman and, funny enough, brother to the philosopher Seneca, and another businessman known as Petilius. There's a quote here that refers to how Martial would spend his days serving these patrons. It says, as a young writer, Martial spent most of his days traveling from the home of one rich patron to another, providing services, paying his respects, and receiving small token payments and favors in return. And if you know anything about the art world, then you know that this kind of service to patrons is not an uncommon system. In fact, some of the people that I've covered in this podcast went through a similar system, and a few other people to mention here would be Michelangelo, famous painter, but served under Pope Julius II. And even the composer Johann Sebastian Bach, he's someone who worked under the patronage of courts and churches. And yet, despite this being quite common, Martial absolutely hated it. He hated every minute of it. He hated serving his patrons. He believed that the system of serving to create art effectively made him a slave. And this resentment or this frustration is kind of understandable, considering that patrons could have influenced the direction of the work that he was doing. And even if they didn't, art was always created in the context of this huge power imbalance that he had with his patrons. You yourself might be listening to this and say, yeah, it kind of resonates with me. In fact, you may have just graduated from university or college, a place where you were free and, able to explore ideas on your own terms and in your own time. And suddenly you find yourself now working in an entry-level position somewhere where the work is outlined by the people above you, people you probably don't respect. And there's no room for you to think or choose what to work on. And because of this, sometimes you might find yourselves dreaming of working for yourself, escaping the shackles, creating for yourself. Marshall certainly did this. He imagined a future where he lived like a country squire, basically like the patrons he served. And in this place, he could finally create in peace. He could create anything he wanted. And most importantly, he could do so with full independence. In fact, the resentment that was around this notion of having to serve actually shows up in his work. Holiday writes, Marshall's writing often drags with hatred and bitterness about Rome's upper crust, from which he believed he was cruelly shunted aside. But it's here that Ryan Holiday actually asks a question of Marshall and clues us into an alternative strategy to just, dreaming of getting out. He says, what Marshall couldn't see was that it was his unique position as an outsider to society that gave him such fascinating insight into Roman culture that it survives to this day. So instead of being pained by such a system, what if he'd been able to come to terms with it? And this is where we'll introduce the canvas strategy. Again, that idea we mentioned at the beginning, to find canvases for other people to paint on. In the Roman times, there was this role that Holiday makes us aware of called an antiambulo. And this effectively means the one who clears the path. As the book notes, an antiambulo proceeded in front of his patron anywhere they traveled in Rome, making way, communicating messages, and generally making the patron's life easier. But what does this mean for us in practice? Well, it means creating opportunities for others to shine. And we can do this by providing support for them, eliminating obstacles for them, and then finding ways to promote or bolster their strengths. Really, the canvas strategy is about shifting our focus from seeking immediate recognition to enabling others, helping others, and fostering a collaborative environment in the place that you work in. In fact, this might not even really be the time for you to start looking to create your masterworks yet. You might still be lacking in terms of skills, knowledge, network to create that product or piece of art that, would go on to have the impact for you to build a lasting career on it, which links to that idea of the perennial seller that Ryan Holiday has written extensively about. And regarding this power imbalance that might cause frustration and the feeling that you're held back, well, whilst there are outliers who definitely, want to just simply dominate those who work for them, most managers in reality just want to do a good job and make great products and great results. And there's nothing really to say that the people under them inside this org chart that you might look at and say, well, I'm at the very bottom, I'm underneath all these people, but there's nothing to say that in that position, you can't find and present ways for the people above you to do just that, to do a good job, to make great products and to have great results. And in fact, by doing this well over time, you'll actually be taking a load off their plate and becoming someone that they trust and want to turn to for ideas and future projects and so on. But you might be hearing this and say, why would I do all of this for others? Why not do it for myself? But this way of thinking misses the opportunities that lie in working for others. Ryan Holiday was an antiambulo himself under Robert Greene, who's an author that I've mentioned many times on this podcast before, but he wrote the legendary books 48 Laws of Power, The Art of Seduction, Mastery, and The Laws of Human Nature. And we'll come back to how exactly Ryan applied his canvas strategy with Robert Greene. But I mention Greene because it's in Mastery, I think his best book, that he details the power of an apprenticeship and captures the kind of nuances that exist in this early stage so beautifully. He writes, it's a simple law of human psychology that your thoughts will tend to revolve around what you value most. If it is money, you will choose a place for your apprenticeship that offers the biggest paycheck. Inevitably, in such a place, you will feel greater pressures to prove yourself worthy of such pay. You will be focused on yourself, your insecurities, the need to please and impress the right people, and not on acquiring skills. It will be too costly for you to make mistakes and learn from them, so you will develop a cautious, conservative approach. This is something that Ryan Holiday himself has referred to and he calls overreaching or overextending. Instead, you must value learning above everything else. This will lead you to all of the right choices. You will opt for a situation that will give you the most opportunities to learn, particularly with hands-on work. You will choose a place that has the people and mentors who can inspire and teach you. A job with mediocre pay has the added benefit of training you to get by with less, a valuable life skill. You must never disdain an apprenticeship with no pay. In fact, it is often the height of wisdom to find the perfect mentor and offer your services as an assistant for free. Happy to exploit your cheap and eager spirit, such mentors will often divulge more than the usual trade secrets. In the end, by valuing learning above all else, you will set the stage for your creative expansion and the money will soon come to you. In effect, you can think of the Canvas strategy as part of a greater, longer-term strategy to be able to learn, grow, and eventually benefit from the skills and association and ideas that you will have garnered from having effectively laid the foundations for someone else to build their house on. Holiday actually writes about this as well, and he says, it reduces your ego at a critical time in your career, letting you absorb everything you can without the obstructions that block others' vision and progress. So now let me give you an example of someone who effectively did this, and it's an example of someone that I've covered in a previous Icons episode extensively before, so if you want to learn more about that person, please dive into it. But it's Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo da Vinci, his father, when he was young, took da Vinci's drawings to an artist and an engineer to his workshop in Florence, a man named Verrocchio. And Verrocchio was super impressed. I mean, he loved the drawings that da Vinci had done. And so actually offered da Vinci an apprenticeship at his workshop in Firenze, in Florence. And the workshop had already been working on all sorts. We're talking ornate tombs for the Medicis, a statue of Christ made of bronze. They were creating the Medici's antiques, and they were even doing paintings of the Madonna, usually for merchants who were trying to display their wealth and piety at the same sort of time. But the thing is, before joining this workshop, da Vinci was actually drawing nature. He would go to a nature reserve nearby where he lived, and he would sit there for hours and he would draw flowers, grass, animals, waterfalls. He was just drawing what he observed, and that was usually nature. But at Verrocchio's studio, they were working on totally different products, right? And so there was a need for da Vinci to learn completely new things. We're talking sculpturing, metalwork. He was actually encouraged to learn engineering and mechanics. In fact, there was a dedicated period where Verrocchio asked for da Vinci to really move away from drawing nature, what he'd drawn previously, and instead draw man-made materials. So the study was actually called drapery studies. And it was here that he would observe clothing or curtain material and look at how the materials present light and also overlap to cast shadows. Ultimately, Verrocchio had da Vinci do all of this, put all of his talents to work so that Verrocchio can put his own name on the work. During this time, da Vinci would get no credit or percentage of the sale of any of these products. But the beauty and the wisdom in da Vinci is that he remained open this entire time. He saw the opportunities to learn new skills and did so very, very quickly. He even became interested in topics that he'd never considered before, like math. And this all later contributes to him becoming a person who has all these, concentric circles that overlap in terms of interest and skills, and eventually make him the most renowned polymath that we have in history. But more than that, it even showed him how to make his studies profitable. If you think about it, up until that point, he'd just been drawing nature, he'd just been drawing the things that caught his eye, but never before had he been exposed to the sort of things that people wanted to buy, people wanted to commission. So this was a great means of exposing him to those sorts of things. So we can take from this that by clearing the path, by supporting and enabling Verrocchio, da Vinci learned the skills to be able to explore every curiosity he had. And later, this was very important because it meant that it later turned him into the most famous engineer, visionary, and artist of all of history. And despite the lack of credit at the time, I actually recently visited Firenze and went to the Uffizi Gallery and saw Verrocchio's painting called The Baptism of Christ, a huge painting hanging very proudly, except despite it being Verrocchio's painting, it now sat in a very important room. It sat in the Da Vinci room. And it's here that People observed the painting not for Verrocchio's work, but for the details that came from Da Vinci's skills exercised rather than Verrocchio's. But you might be hearing this and saying, okay, but that's a very old example that was someone in the 1400s. How can I relate to that? Well, a more modern example is actually that of Ryan Holiday himself. Ryan Holiday had patrons, particularly patrons in the writing world. And as I mentioned earlier, he was effectively an anti-ambulo. And there's two particular patrons he had. They were Tucker Max and Robert Greene. In college, Ryan Holiday wrote a column for his college newspaper, something that he's said was quite easy and anyone could have done it, but he did something very specific. He took an opportunity to write about a blog that he enjoyed reading. The blog was by a man named Tucker Max. And so he wrote a review about the blog. And then I think he even sent the article to Tucker Max. But eventually, Tucker Max saw this and they had an exchange of emails between the two of them. But the entire time, Holiday ensured he only emailed when he had something to offer Tucker Max. And this usually came in the form of articles, articles that he thought Tucker Max would find interesting and would likely source for future articles, future ideas, and maybe future books. Basically, Ryan Holiday was deploying the canvas strategy. He was finding canvases for Max to paint on. And this started a kind of unofficial internship. If you think about Robert Greene's quote earlier, I'm sure Max was happy to exploit the cheap and eager spirit of Ryan Holiday. But you know what happens after a while of this? There's a form of reciprocity. In fact, it's a psychological law, the law of reciprocity. And this comes about when, you've received or gotten something for a long time. Usually the mentality is that you feel you need to give something back. Well, Max did give something back. Max gave Ryan Holiday a life-changing connection because he brought Ryan Holiday with him to a lunch meeting with Robert Greene. And it was at this lunch meeting that Robert Greene mentions at one point a struggle he was having with research assistants. And Ryan Holiday at that moment, 19 years old, by the way, offers himself to be just that for Robert Greene. And this was easy for Robert Greene to accept, by the way, because in his spare time, Ryan Holiday had actually studied all of the books in the bibliography of Robert Greene's 48 Laws of Power. So we're talking about every book that's sourced as a reference in the back of the book. Ryan Holiday had gone through them. He liked Robert Greene's writing and said, well, I want to understand where he got these ideas from. And so went through and studied all of those books. So effectively, if you think about it, he had prepared long before game day. But that said, the work with Robert Greene was not glamorous. Ryan Holiday had to transcribe these long conversations, usually between, at the time, I believe it was with 50 Cent, as Robert Greene was preparing to write his book, 50th Law, which was focused primarily on 50 Cent and actually one of the books that I read in preparation for the first episode of Icons, which focused on 50 Cent. Ryan Holiday had to also scour books and Wikipedia pages for stories that Greene could later use in his future books. Ultimately, once again, Ryan Holiday was finding canvases for Robert Greene to paint on. But what did Ryan Holiday get in return? Well, firstly, it exposed him to the inner workings of making a book. It made real what Ryan Holiday had only ever dreamt of at that point. He wanted to be an author, he wanted to be a writer, but finally he could see up close how you take an idea through research, through exploration, through curation of research, through writing, through packaging, and then through publishing and even marketing. In effect, Ryan Holiday saw the entire process in all of its steps. He also, at the same time, and even more importantly, got to see the life of an author, the daily life of an author. And he did this in real life, not as Marshall did when he imagined what it would be like to maybe be, one of these rich patrons. He actually saw it every day. And, he could see that an author's life is effectively one where you're spending most of your time alone. And you're required to think and concentrate on a single topic for years. But clearly, we can conclude that Ryan Holiday loved this. And he's honed his career doing just this for over a decade in publishing his own books now. Ryan Holiday has credited Robert Greene in his podcast and his videos many, many times as being someone who helped him, but more specifically, helped him find his agent, his first book deal, and even provided quotes for him to blurb his books. So you can clearly see where this has been an invaluable association that will forever be a reward for the time that Ryan Holiday spent finding canvases for Green to paint on. And I'm sure this is something he still does today. But what if you're working for someone you don't admire? That was one of the things we talked about at the beginning, right? Working for people, having to work for people you don't respect. Let's be honest, not all of our bosses can be Robert Greene, right? Well, this is where I'd recommend using an idea that I think works very well in conjunction with the canvas strategy. It's an idea from Miyamoto Musashi, who was a lone wandering warrior in Japan, a ronin, if you will, during the late 1500s to early 1600s. And you would usually think of these types as being samurai, right? Well, a technical detail, it's not a samurai, because a samurai was someone who served a military leader or a feudal lord known as shogun or daimyo. But instead, ronin were masterless. They didn't have anyone they served. And yet, despite that, most ronin actually sought out opportunities to find masters, people to serve. And they did this by volunteering themselves to fight in a battle that the masters were involved in. If you will, they were kind of like weapons for hire. And their end goal, I think, in doing this was in hopes of being taken in under the shogun and, giving them the opportunity to assume the rank of samurai, a word which literally translates to serve. But Miyamoto Musashi sought out a deeper opportunity in this, not to assume the rank of samurai. Instead, Miyamoto Musashi saw that he was not lending himself to an army, he was borrowing the battlefield. That's how he referred to it, and that's the idea for us to take away here. He says he did this for his own development, as part of the study of the art of swordsmanship. Miyamoto Musashi's main motivation was to find battles to practice the craft of swordsmanship, something that he cared deeply for, in an environment where the stakes are real. He was learning by doing. And you might be able to relate to this, where at university you may have been able to explore different ideas, but as soon as you started working, you got to practice for real. You got to have stakes against your work. Now, obviously, they're not going to be as intensely real or as high as Miyamoto Musashi, whose stakes were basically life and death. It was the difference between practicing sword strokes against a dummy to that of fighting in an army against many an enemy and having to survive in order to learn, right? Well, with this, Miyamoto Musashi never became a samurai. And yet, he served many times over his life. And he did this over 60 fights. And in the end, Miyamoto Musashi became one of the most famous duelists of all time. He eventually went on to write the definitive text on swordsmanship, an excellent book called Gorin no Sho, which translates to the Book of Five Rings. And just as a testament to how good Miyamoto Musashi was, this man died of thoracic cancer. He did not die in any of his battles. I want to also mention here that Ryan Holiday talks about a form of advice that Robert Greene gave him, one where it acknowledged that there was dead time and then there's alive time. There's a quote I want to read here from a blog post that he wrote about this, where he says, "Dead time is when you're sitting around waiting for things to happen to you. And alive time is when you're in control, making every second count, improving, learning, growing." Miyamoto Musashi chose for his time to be alive, even when he had no real master he could look up to. In a sense, he became his own master, even though his income, came from fighting for other people's causes. So whilst you may think you need to be your own boss, escape the shackles of working for someone else in order to do the work that you're proud of, like, Marshall did, in reality, even with a boss that you don't admire, you're likely in an environment where the risk isn't on you, right? You don't run the business. The business doesn't collapse if you fail when you're trying to do something. So use that. Make your time alive. Take more risks. Try out new skills, techniques. In fact, make more connections whilst you don't need the rewards to return to you so immediately. Now, this is not just about those who are young and ambitious. And in fact, this can be applied at any time. This is something that Ryan Holiday himself writes about. He says, The Canvas strategy is there for you at any time. There is no expiration date on it. It's one of the few that age does not limit on either side, young or old. You can start at any time. It is a rewarding and infinitely scalable power strategy. Consider each one an investment in relationships and in your own development. Because if you pick up this mantle once, you'll see what most people's egos prevent them from appreciating. The person who clears the path ultimately controls the direction, just as the canvas shapes the painting. So, to summarize, the canvas strategy is an excellent strategy for anyone trying to make things because it does three things. It reduces your ego at a critical time and opens you up to opportunities to learn new skills. It also gives you the opportunity to see your masters work up close and see the steps that really are necessary to make the thing that you might want to make. And ultimately, when deployed well, it gives you a way to make all of your time a live time. To summarize the idea best, I want to leave you with the words of Ryan Holiday himself, who writes, "That's what the canvas strategy is all about. Helping yourself by helping others, making a concerted effort to trade your short-term gratification for a longer-term payoff." I first read the article Ryan Holiday wrote when I was at university, which is almost 10 years ago now, and I've been deploying the canvas strategy at every opportunity I could since then in my own career. But one thing I wish I had was a kind of canvas strategy checklist, a set of questions, if you will, to ask myself at any time, just to make sure that I was making the most of the strategy, to make sure that my time was as alive as possible. So that's what I've made. I've made a canvas strategy checklist. And in the description of the podcast, you'll actually be able to find a link to the PDF that I've made that you can download for free and, print off and stick on your wall to always remember those questions and see how you can best make your time alive. So do find that in the link in the description below. Also, for more icons, follow on Twitter or Icon Podcast on LinkedIn to discover weekly creativity tips from the greatest makers in history. And whatever you find yourself listening to this on, just know that Icons is available across every platform you can think of. We're talking YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Overcast, Amazon Music, Pocket Cast, and much, much more. So wherever you prefer to listen to your podcast, please subscribe there and leave us a review if you've enjoyed this episode. And with that, I've been Justin Campbell-Platt. This is Icons. Thank you for listening.